In the vast expanse of civilized space where bureaucratic efficiency met evolutionary malice, there existed a world that functioned as both punishment and punchline rolled into one catastrophically effective package. The Kethmoran High Command, in their infinite wisdom and finite imagination, had designated it as Penal Colony, designation Zeta-7. The locals, what few survived long enough to develop opinions, simply called it Hell's Cafeteria. The planet's official classification read like a xenobiologist's fever dream. Class 12 Death World, extreme hazard rating, atmospheric composition suitable for breathing, if you enjoyed that sort of thing, and most importantly, home to 17 distinct apex predator species. The bureaucrats who compiled these reports had clearly never visited personally, which explained why they described the ecosystem as naturally self-regulating rather than a continuous bloodbath orchestrated by evolution's most sadistic impulses. The transport vessel bureaucratic necessity hung in orbit like a metallic middle finger extended toward the concept of due process. Its cargo bay doors opened with all the ceremony of a cosmic belch, ejecting another pod toward the surface below. Inside that pod, compressed into a space barely larger than a coffin, sat the latest addition to the planet's food chain. The woman had committed the unforgivable crime of embarrassing 3 different galactic governments simultaneously, a feat that required considerable skill, worse timing, and the kind of stubborn principles that made accountants weep. The pod's occupant examined her surroundings with the detached interest of someone who had already mentally filed her impending death under occupational hazards. The descent trajectory display showed a cheerful countdown to impact, complete with helpful warnings about atmospheric entry temperatures and probability of survival. Current odds, 12.7%, assuming she avoided the 17 apex predator species, the toxic spore clouds, the acidic rain, and the geological instability that made the planet's surface shift like a drunk trying to walk a straight line. The impact came with less fanfare than expected. A solid thud followed by the pod's automated systems cheerfully announcing her arrival at destination reached. The hatch hissed open, releasing the familiar smell of recycled air into an atmosphere that tasted like copper pennies and regret. She stepped onto alien soil that crunched underfoot, with what might have been dried vegetation or the pulverized bones of previous visitors. The distinction seemed academic. The landscape stretched before her like a twisted artist's interpretation of natural selection run amok. Crystalline formations jutted from the ground at angles that hurt to look at, while in the distance what appeared to be trees swayed in patterns that suggested they were less plant and more predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. The sky overhead maintained a color that existed somewhere between purple and the feeling of impending doom, streaked with clouds that moved against the wind in ways that defied both meteorology and common sense. Her first visitor arrived within minutes, because apparently even cosmic horror observed punctuality. The creature emerged from behind one of the crystal formations with the fluid grace of something that had never encountered prey clever enough to survive its opening gambit. It stood roughly humanoid in shape, if humans had been designed by a committee of serial killers with access to industrial welding equipment. 6 limbs ended in appendages that served as both hands and bladed weapons, while its head featured an arrangement of sensory organs that would have made an architect sob. The woman watched its approach with the sort of professional interest one might show a particularly complex equation. The creature's hunting pattern followed predictable parameters, circling to cut off escape routes, using its superior speed to maintain tactical advantage, employing intimidation displays to trigger prey response patterns. All very logical, all very alien, all completely unprepared for what came next. Instead of running, fighting, or displaying any of the fear responses that had served as appetizers for this creature's previous meals, she pulled out a small device from her survival kit. Not a weapon, those had been confiscated during processing. Not a communication device, those were jammed by the planet's natural electromagnetic field. Instead, she extracted what appeared to be a simple metal tool, something so mundane that the creature paused mid-stalk, its predatory algorithms struggling to process this unexpected development. The tool was a tuning fork. She struck it against one of the crystal formations, and a pure, clear note rang across the landscape. The hunting creature froze, as if someone had pressed its pause button, its multiple eyes focusing and unfocusing as it tried to categorize this new stimulus. The sound wasn't threatening. Prey didn't typically make musical announcements before becoming lunch. It wasn't communication. The frequency matched no known distress signals or territorial markers. It was simply sound for the sake of sound, tone without tactical purpose. The creature's confusion bought her enough time to identify a defensive position among the crystal formations. She moved with economy rather than panic, selecting a spot that offered multiple escape routes while limiting approach angles. The crystalline structures resonated with the tuning fork's note, creating harmonics that seemed to confuse her pursuer further. It stalked around her position in increasingly agitated circles, its hunting instincts warring with its inability to categorize her behavior. What the creature couldn't understand, what none of the planet's carefully catalogued apex predators could understand, was that it had just encountered something genuinely unprecedented in its evolutionary experience. Not a stronger predator, not a more venomous threat, not even particularly clever prey. Instead, it had met something that made noise simply because it could, something that found order in chaos, not through dominance, but through the imposition of arbitrary patterns like musical scales and harmonic intervals. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but the planet's ecosystem had its own schedule to maintain. Something much larger was approaching through the crystalline forest, something that made the ground tremble with each step, and caused the smaller predator to abandon its confusion in favor of immediate retreat. The woman watched her first would-be killer disappear into the geometric wilderness, and couldn't help but appreciate the irony. She'd survived her first encounter on a death world not through superior firepower or cunning tactics, but by introducing a concept so alien to the local ecosystem that it had caused a complete tactical system failure. The approaching footsteps grew closer, each impact sending vibrations through the crystal formations that created their own musical notes. She listened to the unintentional symphony and felt something that might have been optimism. If the planet wanted to kill her, it would have to learn to deal with the fact that humans had spent millennia turning everything, including their own impending deaths, into opportunities for artistic expression. The real apex predator was coming, and she was about to give it a lesson in the most dangerous human trait of all, the compulsive need to make beautiful noise in the face of oblivion. The thing that emerged from the crystalline forest moved with the sort of confidence that comes from never having met anything it couldn't dismantle. Standing 3 meters at what might generously be called shoulders, it possessed the kind of anatomical architecture that suggested evolution had gotten bored with subtlety and decided to experiment with industrial machinery instead. Its hide bore the texture of interwoven metal cables, while its limbs terminated in appendages that looked like someone had crossed surgical instruments with mining equipment. The woman watched its approach with the clinical detachment of a physicist observing a particularly interesting equation in motion. This was clearly the apex predator the planetary surveys had mentioned with such bureaucratic understatement. The creature that sat at the top of the food chain not through accident of birth, but through systematic elimination of anything foolish enough to challenge its position. Its movement patterns suggested intelligence beyond mere hunting instinct, tactical awareness that bordered on strategic thinking. What made the situation particularly fascinating from an academic standpoint, and terrifying from a survival perspective, was that the creature appeared to be studying her with the same analytical intensity she was applying to it. Its sensory arrays, a collection of organs that defied easy categorization, swept across her position in methodical patterns. It was conducting reconnaissance, gathering data, preparing for an engagement that it clearly expected to be brief and decisive. The opening gambit came without warning. The creature launched itself forward with acceleration that physics should have found embarrassing, covering the distance between them in a blur of coordinated limbs and tactical violence. The woman's response was to dive sideways into a gap between crystal formations, a maneuver that the creature had obviously anticipated. Its trajectory adjusted mid-leap, claws extending to intersect her escape route with mathematical precision. What it hadn't anticipated was her secondary movement, a controlled tumble that took her under its airborne form and allowed her to strike another crystal formation with her tuning fork as she rolled. The pure tone rang out again, and the creature's landing became significantly less graceful as its sensory systems attempted to process this inexplicable auditory input. It hit the ground in a controlled crash, recovering quickly but with visible confusion disrupting its tactical flow. The woman used the momentary disorientation to establish a new defensive position, this time selecting a cluster of resonant crystals that would amplify any sound she produced. The creature circled her location with predatory patience, its earlier confidence replaced by something approaching wariness. It had never encountered prey that fought back with noise pollution, and its evolutionary programming lacked protocols for dealing with enemies who weaponized recreational music making. The second attack came from an unexpected angle. The creature had learned from its first attempt and approached from below, utilizing the planet's unstable geology to tunnel beneath her position. The ground erupted in a shower of crystalline debris as several hundred kilograms of apex predator emerged like a biological missile. The woman's response was to leap onto the creature's back, using its own momentum to carry her to safety while simultaneously running the tuning fork along its metallic hide. The sound that resulted was neither musical nor pleasant, a harsh scraping that combined the fork's pure tone with the creature's natural resonance to create something that fell somewhere between industrial accident and experimental jazz. The creature's reaction was immediate and violent, thrashing in patterns that suggested its nervous system was receiving contradictory signals from multiple sources. It rolled, twisted, and performed what could only be described as an involuntary interpretive dance routine while trying to dislodge its unwanted passenger. The woman held on with the determination of someone who understood that letting go would result in her immediate conversion from person to protein supplement. She continued dragging the tuning fork across the creature's hide, creating a symphony of metallic screeches that seemed to short-circuit its predatory instincts. The creature's movements became increasingly erratic, its tactical thinking overwhelmed by sensory input it had no framework for processing. What followed was a chase sequence that would have challenged the sanity of any xenobiologist forced to document it. The creature pursued her through the crystalline forest with homicidal determination, while she used every available surface to create musical chaos that disrupted its hunting patterns. Tree analogues became percussion instruments, crystal formations became resonating chambers, and the very ground beneath their feet became part of an impromptu orchestra that played the soundtrack to their deadly ballet. The creature adapted with frightening speed, learning to anticipate her sonic tactics and adjust its approach accordingly. It began avoiding surfaces that might produce sound when struck, planning attack routes that would limit her access to resonant materials, and even attempting to attack during the brief silences between her musical assaults. The intelligence behind those analytical arrays was considerable, and it was applying that intelligence to the problem of how to kill something that insisted on turning their deathmatch into a concert performance. The escalation was inevitable. As the creature's tactics evolved, so did the woman's responses. She began combining sounds, creating harmonies and dissonances that seemed to affect not just her primary pursuer but the entire local ecosystem. Smaller predators emerged from hiding to investigate the commotion, only to retreat in confusion when exposed to her experimental compositions. Plants that had been swaying in predatory anticipation began moving in patterns that suggested they were attempting to dance, their root systems apparently confused by rhythm into thinking they were supposed to keep time. The crystalline formations themselves began responding to the sustained musical assault, their natural resonance creating feedback loops that amplified and modified the original sounds. What had started as simple tones from a tuning fork evolved into complex harmonics that filled the air with frequencies that existed nowhere else in the known galaxy. The acoustic environment became so chaotic that the apex predator's sophisticated sensory systems began providing contradictory data, its evolutionary advantages neutralized by sensory overload. The chase reached its crescendo when the woman found herself cornered against a cliff face that rose like a natural amphitheater, its curved walls perfect for acoustic amplification. The creature approached with renewed confidence, recognizing that she had finally run out of escape routes and resonant surfaces to weaponize. Its movement slowed to a predatory stalk, sensing victory within reach. After what had been the most frustrating hunt in its considerable career, behind it, the crystalline forest had fallen silent, except for confused rustling as various lifeforms attempted to understand why their habitat had suddenly developed musical ambitions. The woman stood with her back to the stone wall, tuning fork raised, like the world's most impractical sword, while several tons of apex predator prepared to end their bizarre duet with extreme prejudice. The creature gathered itself for the final leap, muscles coiling with stored energy, sensory arrays locked onto their target. Victory was inevitable. Prey cornered, escape routes eliminated, and hopefully, mercifully, no more of that infernal noise that had turned a simple hunt into an acoustic nightmare. That was when she took a deep breath, pursed her lips, and decided to try something completely different. The sound that emerged from the woman's lips was nothing like the metallic clanging and crystalline resonance that had characterized their previous exchanges. It was a simple melody, 5 notes ascending in a pattern that any human child would recognize as the opening bars of a tune their species had been humming for millennia. The melody was light, cheerful, and utterly inappropriate for the circumstances, which made it perhaps the most devastating weapon ever deployed on this particular battlefield. The apex predator, mid-leap and fully committed to converting its tormentor into a nutritious paste, experienced what could only be described as a complete system crash. Its sophisticated neural networks, evolved over countless generations to process threats, prey behavior, and tactical situations, encountered data that simply refused to compute. The creature's momentum carried it forward, but its predatory coordination had been replaced by something resembling a controlled fall mixed with existential confusion. It landed in a heap approximately 2 meters from its intended target, sensory arrays twitching as they attempted to categorize this new form of acoustic input. The whistling wasn't communication. It carried no information, made no demands, issued no warnings. It wasn't intimidation. The melody was far too cheerful for that. It wasn't even properly musical in the way the tuning fork had been. Lacking the mathematical precision of harmonic intervals, it was simply human making noise because humans apparently whistled when they were nervous. The creature's confusion was profound and immediate. In its considerable experience, prey that was cornered either fought desperately, attempted to flee, or submitted to its fate with whatever dignity its species could muster. Prey did not, under any circumstances, begin producing recreational melodies that sounded like they belonged at a picnic, rather than a predation event. The cognitive dissonance was severe enough to temporarily override its hunting instincts entirely. The woman continued whistling, apparently oblivious to the fact that she had just introduced an entirely new form of psychological warfare to an ecosystem that had been operating on relatively straightforward principles of violence and consumption. The melody was infectious in ways that transcended species barriers, not because of any mystical properties, but because rhythm and pattern were fundamental aspects of existence that even alien neurology couldn't completely ignore. The effect spread beyond the apex predator. Throughout the crystalline forest, creatures that had been following the sounds of the chase began emerging from their hiding places, drawn by curiosity rather than hunger. The melody was unlike anything in their evolutionary experience. Purposeless sound that somehow suggested order, pattern without function, beauty without survival advantage. Their predatory instincts, finely tuned for millennia of successful hunting, simply had no protocol for dealing with something that made noise purely for aesthetic reasons. The apex predator attempted to reassert its dominance by rising to its full height and issuing what was presumably an intimidating roar. The sound was impressive, a combination of mechanical grinding and organic fury that should have sent every living thing within several kilometers scrambling for cover. Instead, the woman paused her whistling just long enough to tilt her head, as if considering the creature's vocalization, then resumed her melody with a slight variation that somehow incorporated the rhythm of the predator's roar into her musical framework. This development pushed the creature beyond confusion into what could only be described as an identity crisis. It had just witnessed its most powerful intimidation display being casually repurposed as percussion accompaniment. The fundamental assumptions that had guided its existence, that it was the apex predator, that its presence inspired terror, that other creatures existed primarily to serve as food sources, were being systematically dismantled by someone who appeared to be treating their life-or-death encounter as an opportunity for musical improvisation. The creature's behavioral patterns began to degrade rapidly. It circled the woman's position, but without the focused intent of a hunter. More like a confused animal trying to understand a situation that fell outside its experiential framework. Its movements became hesitant, almost tentative, as if it was afraid that any aggressive action might result in its fearsome roar being turned into a backing track for another cheerful melody. Other predators began arriving, drawn by the commotion and the unprecedented sight of their apex colleague apparently engaged in some form of interpretive dance with a creature that should have been dead several minutes ago. They approached cautiously, their own predatory instincts warring with curiosity about the strange sounds filling the air. The woman's whistling had created an acoustic environment that their evolutionary programming simply couldn't parse, not dangerous enough to flee from, not submissive enough to attack, just persistently, inexplicably cheerful. The breaking point came when the woman transitioned from her original melody to something that sounded suspiciously like a lullaby. The apex predator, already struggling with the collapse of its worldview, responded to the gentle rhythm by visibly relaxing. Its battle-ready posture softened, its sensory arrays retracted slightly, and for a moment that would have horrified xenobiologists across the galaxy, the most dangerous creature on a planet full of dangerous creatures appeared to be swaying gently in time with the music. The realization of what was happening hit the creature like a physical blow. It was being pacified, not by superior force or cunning tactics, but by something that registered in its neural networks as comforting rather than threatening. The apex predator of a death world was being lulled into tranquility by what amounted to alien elevator music. The psychological damage was immediate and severe. It backed away from the woman, movements jerky with what might have been embarrassment if the creature had possessed the emotional framework to experience such a concept. Its retreat triggered a cascade effect among the gathered predators, who interpreted their leader's withdrawal as a signal that the strange noise-making creature was somehow more dangerous than it appeared. They began their own retreat, moving with the cautious respect typically reserved for forces of nature or particularly volatile explosives. The woman, still whistling, watched the apex predator's dignity collapse in real time. The creature that had been the undisputed master of its domain just minutes earlier was now backing away from someone who weighed less than one of its appendages, defeated not by strength or cleverness, but by the bewildering realization that it had no idea how to kill something that insisted on being cheerful about the whole process. The final indignity came when the creature's retreat was interrupted by its own attempt to roar defiance. The sound came out as a confused whimper that somehow harmonized with the woman's melody, creating an accidental duet that suggested the galaxy's most feared predator was attempting to join in rather than issue a threat. The creature's expression, if something with that many sensory organs could be said to have expressions, conveyed pure existential horror. The standoff that followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of interspecies conflict. The woman continued her melodic repertoire, while the apex predator crouched at what it apparently considered a safe distance, occasionally making tentative vocalizations that seemed designed to test whether they would be incorporated into the ongoing musical performance. The other gathered predators formed a loose circle around the scene, their confusion palpable as they tried to understand whether they were witnessing a territorial dispute, a mating ritual, or some form of artistic collaboration. As the woman's whistling echoed through the crystalline forest, carried by the natural acoustics of the cliff face and amplified by the resonant properties of the local geology, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in the ecosystem's balance of power. The apex predator's authority had been undermined not by a superior predator, but by something far more dangerous to a system based on fear and violence: the introduction of joy as a tactical weapon. The creature that had ruled through intimidation and superior firepower was now faced with the unsolvable problem of how to terrify something that responded to mortal danger by humming show tunes. The ecological ramifications of introducing recreational whistling to a death world ecosystem proved catastrophic. Within hours, reports filtered through the planet's monitoring systems to galactic penal administration. Initial alerts were dismissed as sensor malfunctions. Predation rates dropping 97% simply could not be accurate. The second wave painted a picture that challenged fundamental correctional assumptions. Creatures that had perfected efficient murder were now gathering around melodic sources. The carefully balanced ecosystem, designed to eliminate prisoners through natural selection, had transformed into a very large, very dangerous music appreciation society. The former apex predator underwent complete personality restructuring. The creature that once terrorized lesser predators now followed the human at respectful distance, contributing harmonic vocalizations to her performances, its hunting instincts redirected toward protecting the sound source that had become essential to its psychological well-being. The woman, oblivious to conquering an entire planet through recreational humming, continued survival routines with increasingly large audiences. Her daily activities were accompanied by multi-species choruses, attempting to harmonize with whatever melody she produced. The bureaucratic response to these developments followed predictable patterns. Initial reports were met with disbelief, followed by demands for verification, then increasingly frantic attempts to understand how their most secure prison facility had been compromised by someone who appeared to be conducting nature walks rather than fighting for survival. The prison planet's classification was hastily upgraded from anomalous containment breach to anomalous containment breach, though no one could quite explain what had been breached or how. Emergency consultations convened across multiple star systems as specialists attempted to understand how a single human had pacified an entire ecosystem through amateur musical performance. The leading theory involved sonic mind control, though this failed to explain why affected creatures appeared to genuinely enjoy the experience. The most disturbing aspect of the situation from the perspective of galactic corrections authorities was that the human showed no signs of attempting to escape. Traditional prison breaks involved elaborate schemes to overcome security measures and flee to freedom. This prisoner had instead established what appeared to be a nature preserve, where she served as both entertainment director and apex predator, ruling through the power of positive reinforcement rather than fear. Field teams reported findings that strained credibility. The death world requiring hazmat suits and heavy weapons was now safe for unprotected reconnaissance, provided visitors endured enforced musical participation. Former killing machines functioned as informal security, protecting their musical director from interruptions. The psychological profiles of the affected predators revealed a transformation that challenged fundamental assumptions about evolutionary behavior. Creatures that had evolved sophisticated hunting strategies over millions of years had abandoned their predatory instincts in favor of what could only be described as musical appreciation. Their neural patterns showed activation in brain regions associated with pleasure and social bonding, as if they had discovered recreational activities after spending their entire evolutionary history focused solely on survival and reproduction. The human herself remained maddeningly unaware of the cosmic implications of her actions. When questioned by remote monitoring systems, she provided responses that suggested she viewed her situation as a minor inconvenience rather than a complete overthrow of established ecological principles. Her daily logs mentioned concerns about food preservation and weather patterns, with casual references to her audience that treated the planet's most dangerous predators as background noise rather than mortal threats. The galactic prison system faced unprecedented crisis. Their most secure facility had been compromised not by superior technology or escape plans, but by someone who had turned incarceration into musical residency. Emergency legislation struggled with prosecuting someone for accidentally creating peaceful society. The broader implications rippled through galactic society as news of the incident spread through diplomatic channels. Advanced civilizations that had spent millennia developing sophisticated methods of population control suddenly found themselves questioning whether their approaches might be fundamentally flawed. If a single individual could reshape an entire ecosystem through the simple act of making joyful noise, what other aspects of civilized behavior were they failing to understand? The final report submitted to the Kethmoran High Command painted a picture that would have been rejected as fiction if it hadn't been supported by extensive sensor data. The galaxy's most secure prison had been transformed into a de facto nature preserve, administered by someone who had never shown any interest in environmental management. The death world that had consumed thousands of previous prisoners was now generating tourism inquiries from xenobiologists eager to study the unprecedented example of interspecies musical collaboration. The bureaucratic recommendation was both simple and impossible to implement. Accept that the prison planet was now effectively under new management and hope that other facilities wouldn't experience similar administrative transfers. The human would remain exactly where she had been sentenced, technically serving her term while simultaneously ruling over a kingdom of reformed predators who who had discovered that life was considerably more enjoyable when accompanied by a soundtrack. The woman herself, still whistling as she went about her daily routine, remained blissfully unaware that she had achieved something that had eluded galactic civilization for millennia: the creation of a society based on joy rather than fear. Her audience of reformed killers continued their musical education, learning that the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy wasn't superior firepower or advanced technology, but the simple human compulsion to make beautiful noise, for no reason other than the fact that silence was boring. And in the end, the galaxy's most sophisticated civilizations found themselves confronted with a truth that their advanced philosophies and complex social structures had somehow overlooked. Sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with violence or ideology, but with someone who refuses to let the universe convince them to stop humming.